All right, let's bring in Frank Gaffney. Frank, I want to take my tour around the world with you, but I have to ask you, did you get to watch it all yesterday? Do you have any thoughts? I thought it was horrible.
I confess I saw snippets rather than the whole thing, but I think the takeaway was pretty much the same as yours, Alex. And you know, in two regards, and you've hit, I think, both of them pretty well this morning. One is, clearly, we have brought up at least a generation or two to be indifferent to one of the most fundamental of our freedoms, which is the right to privacy.
Sure.
It's now sort of second nature for most of us to just say, well, you know, they've got all that information and they won't use it against me, or others won't use it against me. And once you've sort of let that freedom go over the side, it's pretty clear you're not as concerned about others. And speech is a big one for me, as it is for you, and should be for all of us. The right to bear arms is another one, of course. And once these things are in play, you know, you will watch the inexorable erosion of them. Unfortunately, I'm afraid not just at the hands of these IT giants, as they're called, but probably at the hands of big government, which will step in to regulate them. And I must say, I remain convinced that we're better off with a free market solution that derives from breaking these guys up, rather than trying to let some new overlord dictate what they can censor and what they can't censor, which is, I think, what we're going to find if we have government stepping into this role. So thank God for Ted Cruz. I thought he made some very important points about the speech piece of this, and we need a lot more of that in the House today.
Yeah, and we'll play the Ted Cruz exchange probably next hour because that was the highlight. We'll play some other clips as well. But Frank, yes, and hopefully there's a solution that doesn't involve another massive government bureaucracy that'll be easily corruptible. But the point is this is a ticking clock here. We're not going to get anything done by 2018. If Mark Zuckerberg decides he can probably move enough votes to swing entire elections, even presidential elections, at this point, simply by manipulating the way people consume the news via Facebook. And so unless an alternative is brought up, or he starts treating his platform like an internet platform again and not like a publishing platform again, and we'll get into that a little more in the show later, then we're in big trouble here. And I'm very concerned, and this is a theme that you and I talk about, that people are focused on the wrong issues. I rarely purport to be an expert unless we're talking about media bias or something like that, or a puppy ownership. I rarely purport to be an expert, but I'll tell you one thing, Frank, where my expertise is where the news cycle is headed. And this is where it's going. And I was not convinced there was one senator beyond Ted Cruz who understood exactly where we're at in terms of free speech, in terms of free flow of information right now.
Yeah, well, whether they understand it or not is an interesting question. They don't feel the need to be worried about it. That's pretty clear. And you're so right, Alex. I mean, these guys understand, and I think they've even been caught maybe in unguarded moments boasting about their ability to actually manipulate votes. And it turns out, as you know, it's okay when they do it for Democrats, but lest anybody try to balance the field by doing something for Republicans, all hell breaks loose.
All right, so Frank Gaffney's here, Center for Security Policy. Go to securefreedom.org, and you can also go to counterjihad.com to keep up with what Frank's up to. Always enjoy speaking to him. Okay, so let's talk about the situation in Syria. U.S. Navy destroyer heading towards Syria, as the reports that there are even some reports out there, I think it was in Al Jazeera, that there was even a strike from the United States. Is that true? And the president is readying a major decision. Do we know anything beyond that right now? What's the lay of the land?
Based on just the open sourcing, I haven't seen any evidence that the U.S. has already launched a strike. I think one is almost certainly imminent. The president's telegraphed that punch, and the folks who are now forming his national security team, which I'm thrilled to say includes Ambassador John Bolton as his national security advisor, are working through the options. My hope is, Alex, that the options will be not simply, the tactical retaliatory measures that we've seen in the past and that have been most talked about in connection with this latest incident of apparent chemical weapons use by the Assad regime. But they'll be strategic in character. And two things that it seems to me should be key elements, well, three elements that should be key to this response strategically are, one, we need to help the Kurds in the region defend themselves. Yes. These are counterweights to a lot of the bad actors that are now operating, and very much, I think, aligned with us as opposed to virtually everybody else in the mix. Secondly, we need to stand with Israel as it defends itself against what is emerging in Iran, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, for that matter, in terms of real threats to the existence of the state of Israel. And third, I think we need to be clear. Turkey is not an ally of the United States anymore. We need to stop treating them as such, and we need to recognize that they're increasingly acting in ways both in Syria and beyond that are inimical to our vital interests. And I think there's pressure that we can bring to bear there. Those would change the character of this conflict, at least in the minds of those who are on the ground now. It's kind of turning into Spain 1936. We're looking at these hostile forces, whether they're the Russians, the Iranians, Hezbollah, their proxies, the Turks, as well as, of course, the Syrians, all practicing military operations and tactics and honing their weaponry. And I'm afraid that one of the things that will likely happen, especially if we're going to use cruise missiles off of destroyers, is the Russians may well shoot them down. So this will, again, reflect an escalation of the conflict, and I think we better be thinking about strategic countermoves to have it more of an even playing field if it is going to be Spain, 1936.
Okay, so let's talk about the options that America has in Syria, because I know this audience is probably made up of a lot of folks who understand how evil Assad is, and it's very tempting to want to take him out and put a lot of pressure on him, if not outright remove him. I think a lot of people are wired, are a little shell-shocked or gun-shy, given how that was essentially the posture of the George Bush administration and the policy of the Bush administration, from which, of course, Ambassador Bolton was a veteran, and we would try to clean up the trash throughout the world, and it would always end up leading to more trash taking its place. Tucker Carlson, for example, has been very vocal, saying that U.S. bombing in Syria is going to lead to situations much, much worse. And I think all of us in this audience are very skeptical of any sort of prolonged conflict, particularly with boots on the ground, which I don't know if that's being discussed at this point. It doesn't appear like it is. But to talk to us about the various factions in terms of who's advocating and for which option and why.
Well, I don't have those kind of insights on the internal deliberations, to be honest with you. I think with McMaster's departure, the prime mover behind the idea we need to put a lot more American forces on the ground has probably left the cabinet. I'm sure that Jim Mattis is in favor of keeping the ones we've got there, and that's said to be on the order of 2,000 with most of them special operators. That, it seems to me, is pretty sensible, and I think the president's clear desire to get them out is probably the wrong thing to be doing in this moment. But the virtue of the approach that I'm talking about, and I would think that John Bolton would be aligned this way too. I believe that his position in the past has been very much in favor of supporting the Kurds, and it's really been horrifying that we have more or less abandoned them in Iraq to the Iranian-backed militias, as they're called, and in Syria to the Turks primarily. I think standing with them, allowing them to be, as they were very powerfully in the fight against ISIS, the boots on the ground, and helping them to preserve their communities against the various forces arrayed against them, I think is a sensible step. I think more or less, it's clear to everybody in the room that the Turks are becoming very problematic, as it is, I think it's clear to everyone in the room that Israel has very legitimate needs to defend itself, especially against the Iranians, beginning to be more and more of a direct threat to them, not just through Hezbollah, but in their own right from Syria as well as Lebanon. So I think that you're going to see a consensus emerge along those lines, with Mattis probably the most reluctant, the military, the Pentagon, the most reluctant to take on the Turks. But it's going to have to happen. The behavior of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, is unmistakably hostile. We have a new book coming out, I believe, next week called Ally No More, available for free at securefreedom.org.
All right, so people should pick that up. Let's turn our focus to the Far East. So a couple of big stories coming out of there. Xi Jinping has been promoting globalism and has been taking shots at the Cold War mentality that is being put out. I took that as sort of a veiled shot at the United States and others. China has denied reports of a plan to build a major South China Sea naval base. They were triggered by Japan building their first Marine unit since World War II, and you've got the United States has said that China has deployed military jamming equipment in South China Sea. That situation, again, another one, Frank, going with a theme here that's escalated, I think, quicker than people have anticipated. What's something we need to know about this one?
I think what we need to be clear about, I said this at CPAC a couple of weeks back, is that China is at war with us. It's not a declared war, to be sure, and thus far, fortunately, it has been mostly nonviolent, but it is a war of primarily an economic and sort of geostrategic positioning character at the moment. But you're right. I think a lot of people have been surprised by this, but it really hasn't been a surprise to those of us who've been watching the Chinese inexorably, even before Xi came to power, but certainly since he's been there, developing kinetic capabilities, that is to say the old-fashioned military kind of capabilities, as well as exercising financial and economic warfare plans and stratagems, very much taken out of the playbook of two People's Liberation Army colonels back in 1999, Alex, called unrestricted warfare. If you go through the checklist of things that they've been planning to do, you'll find that a great many of them have actually come to pass, one of which that is particularly of concern to me is I think the Chinese are finally now pulling the trigger on taking down the dollar as the reserve currency of the world. They've been thinking about it. They've been working towards it. They've been putting into place the capabilities to do it. I think they're about it now. And that has huge implications for our economy, for our debt, for our military capabilities, given what that will mean for the budget and so on. So this is a very serious adversary, and I think we've got to recognize them as such. It's not just the jamming equipment. It's not just the fortified islands in the South China Sea. It's not what they might do there next. It's choke points around the world, as well as these economic, as well as financial, and counter space, and counter cyber warfare. I mean, you go right on down the list, and we're dealing with what is, I believe, yes, undeclared, and thus far, thank God, nonviolent, but warfare nonetheless.
Frank Gaffney's here, Center for Security Policy. Go to securefreedom.org. Go to counterjihad.com. Frank, anything else on your mind this week?
Well, I just would like to say tomorrow, Mike Pompeo is going to be having his confirmation hearing in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Watch this closely, folks, because he will be subjected, I'm sure, to a lot of questioning about these various hotspots and so on. But the line of attack that it seems people on the Hill are going to try to use against him is that he's serious about what, as you know, we call Sharia supremacism. In fact, the one of the indictments against him, I'm told, will be that he's been on my radio show, Alex, a small thing called Secure Freedom Radio, a number of times when he was a congressman. This is an important guy. We need him in that job.
Sure is.
Thank God he's serious about this threat.
Do you think there's any chance he gets held up at this point? I mean, he is. Everyone considers him a top-notch guy, but they just might not agree with all of his positions. But that is not the reason to object to him. Is that he has positions that some people don't like.
Well, it will be for some. The good news is that 15 Democrats, count them, 15 Democrats voted for him just months ago to be the director of the Central Intelligence Agency.
Right.
Generally, in my experience, legislators don't like to be seen as changing their minds. He was qualified for that job. It's at least as sensitive as the Secretary of State position. I believe that they need to hold to that earlier position and confirm him for this job. Their beef with him on Sharia supremacism is really with Donald Trump. And we ought to be very clear about that, Alex. As we've talked about on August 15th, 2016, he laid out a brilliant plan and sold it to the American people for what to do about this threat of the jihadists worldwide, here as well as elsewhere. That's what I believe Mike Pompeo will help him implement, and that's what we need him to do. And I hope that that Republicans, as well as Democrats who voted for him the last time, will give the president this key subordinate to help him get the job done.
Thanks, Frank Gaffney. We'll talk to you next week, sir. Always appreciate it.